Oh my goodness. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to AP World History. This is Mr. Ansharsky, Unit 3. Woot, woot. I'll give you 1 second. No, I do not. There we go. Awesome. So, yes, welcome to Unit 3. This is a very short unit, only 6 chapters, but it is nonetheless a very interesting and very important one. So we are going to start a new unit, as I'll talk about in a second. Bell work on the screen. What are some intellectual developments in Western Europe? If it's not obvious, the Renaissance. All right, let's keep going and then describe that. All right. So we are going to begin Unit 3 by actually going to topic 3.3. And as we'll see in a second, topic 3.3 is all about religious transformations. We're going to look at other places, especially India and a little bit the Middle East, kind of with regard to this question. But we are going to see that religion is a big idea in this chapter, in this unit especially, I should say. So we're going to take a look at transformations in Christianity in Europe especially. And Unit 3 actually brings us to a new time era in AP world, and that is going to be the early modern period, this period between 1450 and 1750. So thinking ahead when you're studying for the AP exam, it is important to kind of group these units into kind of different time periods. Because on the AP, as you're going to see, if you take it in May, we often do have questions that are basically asking you kind of what is different about 1200 to 1450, what's different between 1200 and 1450 and 1450 and 1750. So you should pay attention to kind of things that are changing from units 1 and 2 and into units 3 and 4, which also cover this time period between 1450 and 1750. Unit 3 is going to focus primarily on land-based empires, so empires like the Russians, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, but we're also going to look at kind of the consolidation of power in Western Europe as well. And then Unit 4 will talk about, I guess, overseas empires. I believe it's called mercantile relations or something like that. But anyway, we'll get there later. That's all about the colonies and whatnot. So the unit objective is basically asking you to compare how different empires increased their political influence, political, cultural influence. So pay attention to examples of how governments, how empires expanded their borders, how did they centralize their authority, and how did they exert control outside of their borders. So one of those areas is religion. It's very fitting that our unit begins with religion. So the lesson objective today is asking you to kind of think about what are continuities and changes in religion in the period between 1450 and 1750. We're going to look at Christianity in Western Europe today. Later on, we'll look at the Mughal Empire, how they're handling the religious diversity on the Indian subcontinent. And in Unit 4, actually, we'll also talk about kind of this idea of religious syncretism a lot more. All right, let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to pay attention in this presentation to Western Europe. What is going on in the countries of Western Europe, formerly known as the Latin West? And the event that breaks up that title of a Western Europe that is culturally similar through the common shared religion of Catholicism, the big thing that will break that up is the Protestant Reformation. And we'll define what that means in just a second. But it's going to be, as we will see, a huge change in the practice of Christianity. And we're going to see how it is changing Christianity. And spoiler alert, it's basically leading to new types of Christianity. It's important to understand that there are 3 branches of Christianity. We've discussed Catholicism in the Middle Ages and the end of the Middle Ages a little bit. And then we've also briefly looked at Orthodox Christianity. So we're going to talk about today this time period right here where the arrow is conveniently pointing, and that is going to be the creation of a new type of Christianity, and that new type is Protestantism. So the 3 big branches of Christianity: Catholicism, Orthodox, and Protestantism. And Protestantism itself has like a billion different forms of it. There's Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Catholicism, Anabaptism, etc. All right, let's keep going though. But in order to establish that concept of change, let's look at what Catholic theology was during the Middle Ages. And there are whole college courses on this. I'm not an expert, but we're going to see kind of a general historic view of Catholic theology, and especially pay attention to how that's going to build up to animosity towards anger against the Catholic Church. Well, it's important to understand that Catholic theology, or Catholic systems of belief, Catholic views on what they believe in, that's what theology is, what you believe in, essentially, that Catholic theology is based on two sources. It is based on the Bible, but it's also based on traditions not explicitly mentioned in the Bible. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by that in a second. But essentially, kind of there are two sources of what Christians believe. It comes from directly the Bible, but also things not in the Bible. And the Bible itself is itself kind of a work of translation. We are going to see that the Bible, the Old and New Testament, to use Christian terms, that it was originally written in Hebrew and Greek, respectively. However, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, the body really in charge of deciding the traditions of Catholicism, the Catholic Church is going to translate the Greek and Hebrew into Latin, into the Latin Vulgate, or the Catholic Bible, the Latin translation of the Bible. So we are going to see kind of this authority of the Catholic Church in deciding what exactly the traditions are of the Catholic Church. So we see that best expressed with them translating the Bible into a specific language of Latin. But we also see kind of other things that aren't explicitly mentioned in the Bible being practiced as Catholic theology. For example, we have the saints, we have the kind of worship of important religious figures who hold a power over different aspects of the world, to put that in very weird terms. We also have kind of these feast days for all these saints. There's a holiday for every saint, basically, and there's a saint for everything. So we do kind of see that a lot of Catholic traditions are not in the Bible necessarily. There's nothing about saints in the Bible. But also, who decides this Bible? It's going to be the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is the predominant institution that decides the traditions of Catholicism. Another aspect of Catholic theology that is kind of relevant for our discussion today is going to be the sacrament of penance. And penance, a sacrament first and foremost, is essentially a religious ceremony that is practiced for whatever reason, for religious reasons. But the most important is this idea of penance. And penance essentially is the formal process by which one is forgiven of sins. And there are a whole bunch of different ways you can get this forgiveness. Most of them have to do with you doing something called a good work. And a good work could be anything. Oh, I stole a candy from a baby. I stole candy from a baby. What is my penance, oh Father? Well, my son, it is going to be that you have to pray 5 Hail Marys and you have to give the candy back to the baby or whatever. So you have to do a good thing, essentially, in order to be forgiven of sins. And this is a big deal in Christianity, in Catholicism, because one of the biggest focuses of one of the major focuses of any person during the Middle Ages, and well beyond actually, is going to be this question of where am I going to go after I die? How am I going to spend eternity? And there are really 3 places that a Catholic could go up to. It could be hell, it could be heaven, but it could also be, according to Catholic tradition, purgatory. And essentially, purgatory is where most people will end up. It's kind of a middle ground between heaven and hell. You have to serve a certain amount of years there, depending on your actions on earth, but you can reduce your time in purgatory by having someone do a good work in your name to reduce that sentence in purgatory. And for the Unit 3 test, you wouldn't need to know all of this information. But what is important to understand is that there is an intense social and cultural importance on needing to know where you'll end up in the afterlife. And a big question for a lot of people is, what can I do on earth to determine that? And we'll talk about that more in just a second, because that is going to be an area where we will see corruption. So there is kind of this controversy over what is the best way to get salvation? How are you going to spend your afterlife? All right, well, let's continue. Well, another big aspect of Catholic theology is the supremacy of the Catholic hierarchy, of the Catholic clergy. So we are going to see that the Catholic Church is led by the Pope, as we'll talk about in a second. But more generally, the higher-ups of the Catholic Church, they are the ones largely responsible for determining what Catholics believe, what are acceptable traditions, how do we get that salvation. So the Catholic Church has this absolute power over questions of theology and education. And we saw that in Unit 1 a little bit. We saw how that's starting to crack and weaken during Unit 2. But for now, it's important to understand that the Catholic Church is still the major decider of how most people will spend eternity, how they will spend the afterlife. But we do kind of see that another expression of this authority over matters of theology is the Catholic Church's almost monopoly on Latin. Latin, as you recall, is the language of ancient Rome, and it became the language of the Catholic Church. But the thing is, nobody speaks Latin. Nobody writes in Latin other than literate people. Most people in the Middle Ages, and most people, meaning most peasants, don't know how to read, don't know how to write. So the Catholic Church essentially is monopolizing its spiritual power by controlling the language in which things like the Bible are written in. So Latin is largely reserved for the upper elites, for the people who are supposed to deliver Catholic teachings to the common population, so the clergy or the priests, essentially. And the guy who really determines all of this is the most powerful figure in the Catholic Church, a guy by the title of the Pope. Well, technically his title is the Pontiff, but it's not even that. It's more complicated. But for us, it's the Pope. So the Pope is the primary leader of the Catholic Church. He's the one, and it's always been a he. I think there was a female Pope, but she was killed. And then they had to do this whole process where they checked if you, or never mind. So we are going to see the Pope is on top of all of this. The Pope is the one deciding Catholic theology and has a lot of power over determining what exactly Christians are supposed to believe in. But there's going to be a controversy that will kind of emerge by the end of the Middle Ages, and that we've kind of danced around the edges, and that's going to be a question of what power does the Pope actually have? Does the Pope only have power on earth, temporal power, or does the Pope have a direct say in where people end up in the afterlife? And that is spiritual power. So temporal power is kind of this idea of, is the Pope like an earthly figure? Do they have any spiritual power? And most people who say that the Pope only has temporal power are going to say, well, no, the Pope has no power in deciding the fate of people in the afterlife. He's just a guy. But people who say the Pope has spiritual power, and this is mostly Catholics, they're going to say that the Pope and the entire Catholic Church, by that matter, does have direct influence in the afterlife. Although a third kind of question is popping up. Does the Pope have any power at all? Because there's nothing in the Bible about a Pope. There's nothing in the Bible about how the papacy works. So there is going to be kind of this controversy about what exactly does the Pope have power over. But we're also going to see that the papacy will become politically weakened because of an event known as the Great Western Schism. And the Great Western Schism is not going to lead to a new form of Christianity, but it is a symbol of the weakness of the kind of authority of the Catholic Church. And you wouldn't need to know this for the Unit 3 exam, much less for the AP. But what essentially goes on is that the Pope dies, and that you need to pick out a new Pope, so all the cardinals get together, and then they elect this new guy, and This new kind of pope is going to be loyal to France. He is going to be kept in France in the city of Avignon. And we are going to see that the Pope leaves Rome, the traditional center of the Catholic Church, and then he goes to Avignon. But this is viewed as a kind of slap in the face of tradition, so a second Pope is elected in Rome. Both of them claim to be Pope and then kick each other out of the Catholic Church, and then there's a third Pope that comes along. Anyway, there's Pope fights. Nobody is sure in this time period of the Great Western Schism who exactly is the Pope. So we are going to kind of see that the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is being questioned about whether or not they have just temporal power or power right now on earth, whether or not they have spiritual power, or whether or not they have any power at all, because they're not in the Bible, by the way, because they're not in the Bible. But another big kind of issue by the end of the Middle Ages is the fact that the Catholic Church is going to be pretty corrupt, to put it lightly. We are going to see financial and moral corruption, and basically the effect of all of this corruption, at least in the minds of people who want to fix the Catholic Church, is that priests, that the spiritual leaders of communities, are not following in the example of Jesus Christ. So, kind of at the local level, we are going to see controversies because of priests who aren't really doing their jobs all that well. For one thing, we have priests who can't even read the Bible, for goodness sakes. And priests are supposed to be that moral guide for determining if you're saved to go to heaven or hell. This is a big deal. People want to know that they're going to heaven. Or if they're going to go to hell, what can you do to change that? And if your priest is some guy who can't even read the Bible, what's he going to do? How are they going to help you out in determining salvation? But on top of that, priests aren't very good moral examples at this time as well. We see kind of instances of financial corruption. We see that popes oftentimes kind of skim a little off the top when tithes are collected. So tithes are those taxes peasants pay to the Catholic Church. So we do kind of see that priests aren't being those moral examples. I mean, they're having kids. Priests aren't supposed to have kids. Hell, there was a pope. His name was Alexander Borgia, or Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. He had children. He literally pimped out his daughter to like some Italian guy. I don't remember. It's been a while. So kind of we are seeing that there are instances of corruption in the Catholic Church, morally and financially. But kind of one of the biggest controversies is going to be kind of a very controversial practice known as the sale of indulgences. And an indulgence, to put it very simply, is a get-out-of-jail-free card. It literally is a certificate saying that you don't have to spend this many years in purgatory because you gave a bunch of money to the Catholic Church. So an indulgence essentially is the forgiveness of sin in exchange for a financial contribution to the church. Well, technically it's any good deed, but by the end of the Middle Ages, by the start of what will become the Protestant Reformation, these indulgences were essentially just being bought and sold by rich and powerful people. And kind of one of the main reasons why we see such a controversy about indulgences is that their sale is going to increase under the papacy of Leo X. Leo X was building St. Peter's Basilica, the center of the Catholic Church in Rome, in modern-day Vatican City. So we are going to see that kind of to build this giant structure, you need to sell the forgiveness of sins. You need to raise money by selling indulgences. But the thing about indulgences is twofold. One, it's not in the Bible. It doesn't say anywhere that Jesus forgave sins after some guy gave him a bunch of money. No, it's not in the Bible. The other thing, and more important to us, is that it's viewed as an extremely corrupt practice. I mean, you could kill your brother. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but you could kill your brother. And if you give enough money to the church, well, that just goes away. That's a gross exaggeration, but the idea that you could be forgiven of sins just for giving money and not promising to change your life? What? How is that forgiveness of sins? How are you able to ensure that you're going to go to heaven? So we are going to see that a big controversy about indulgences will emerge, and this is going to be the short-term cause of the Protestant Reformation, as we will see. And then kind of this quote right here is a famous one about the time of Martin Luther, about the time of about the Protestant Reformation. Every time a coin in the coffer springs or rings, when you give a donation to the church for in exchange for the forgiveness of sins, someone goes from purgatory straight to heaven. All right. So all of these controversies about the corruption, about the sale of indulgences, this is going to be kind of one of those causes of what will become known as the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation is going to be a time period in European history when we have these religious reform movements looking to fix the Catholic Church. But eventually, we do see that those reform movements will split off into new types of Christianity, generally called Protestantism. And the Protestant Reformation, or the protesters against the Catholic Church, are largely going to be in places like England and Northern Europe, in places like Northern Germany, modern-day Northern Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, parts of France. But what are some causes of this desire to try and fix the Catholic Church? Well, when those don't work out, separate from the Catholic Church. Well, there are a few causes. For one thing, the Catholic Church's legitimacy has been weakened ever since the end of the Middle Ages. I mean, all this corruption isn't helping. They didn't really kind of solve the Black Death. I mean, what could they do, ideally? But people looked up to the Catholic Church to do something during the Black Death. But guess what? I mean, they couldn't do anything. They were powerless to stop that. So we do see kind of this weakened legitimacy of the Catholic Church going into the early modern period. But we also see one of the big legacies of the Renaissance, and that is Christian humanism. And humanism, in general, is kind of that human-centered philosophy. But Christian humanism is going to have this idea that maybe the Catholic Church gets things wrong sometimes. Maybe they got something wrong translating the Bible into Latin. Maybe they're wrong about the sale of indulgences. So the legacy of Christian humanism from the Renaissance, that's going to be an intellectual cause of the Protestant Reformation. But what else is going on during that will lead us to the Protestant Reformation? Well, we also see the rise of new monarchs. And a new monarch, remember, is a type of monarch who, by the end of the Middle Ages, is gaining more power for themselves. We are seeing the rise of more centralized monarchies across Western Europe. But how is this leading to the Reformation? Well, let's look at two reasons. For one thing, we see that the Catholic Church's power is further declining because monarchs are taking power away from the Catholic Church and giving it to themselves. The Catholic Church is becoming subordinate to secular or non-religious leaders. Well, like non-religious in the sense that they aren't the Pope. So we do see kind of a rise in secular power that comes at the expense of church power. But the rise of this secular centralization also comes at the expense of another group who will largely support the Protestant Reformation, and that is the nobility. We are going to see that a way to resist these centralizing monarchs is by becoming a new type of Christian, by becoming a Protestant. So the resistance to this centralization will lead nobles, primarily in northern Germany, towards Protestantism. But again, kind of the printing press will also help out with all of this. The printing press helps for the diffusion of intellectual ideas. And that is especially going to be true with religious criticisms of the Catholic Church. But the short-term cause of the Protestant Reformation is going to be controversy about indulgences, whether or not it is an acceptable practice. And one of the guys who is going to say that it is not an acceptable practice is a German monk, a German theologian by the name of Martin Luther. I swear to God, Don't confuse Martin Luther with Martin Luther King Jr., like somebody did my first year teaching. Anyway, so Martin Luther, who is he? Well, he was a German monk. He's considered to be the traditional leader of the Reformation, and his ideas are going to kind of be the foundation for what will become the Protestant Reformation. Well, what are his ideas? Well, for one thing, kind of we see that Luther is a student of Christian humanism, literally. He is kind of inspired and directed by these Christian humanists who wanted to fix the Catholic Church. But what exactly does Luther believe in? Well, he believes in a lot of things, but the two most important for us are this idea that the Bible is the sole authority in all matters Christianity, that the Bible is the sole religious authority, and that anything not mentioned in the Bible isn't something that Christians should believe in or practice. For example, there's nothing in the Bible about the papacy. I'm just going to say that right now, according to Luther. There's nothing in there. Sure, there might be the whole story of, oh, Peter, you're my rock or whatever Jesus said. But there's nothing in there about a pope needs to be elected by cardinals who then send up some white smoke into the air. There's nothing about these traditions explicitly in the Bible. So these traditions aren't in the Bible. And therefore, because the Bible is the sole religious authority, we don't need to listen or do them. But another thing about Luther's theology, or system of belief, is that the Bible needs to be widely understood by the common population of Europe, by Christians in general. So Luther's going to make the argument, and he's going to make the action, of translating the Bible from Greek and Hebrew, the original Bible, into the common language of his hometown in Wittenberg of German. So we are going to see that Luther will actually pen a translation of the Bible. The other important belief for Luther is going to be this idea of sola fide, this idea of salvation through faith alone. But what does that mean? You're guaranteed a spot in heaven if you understand and believe what is in the Bible. That's basically it. You need to prove kind of that you are, doing things that are in accordance with the Bible, like, being a nice person, I guess. But it's this basic idea that you don't need to do things like buy an indulgence, basically. So the idea of faith alone is basically this idea that in order to achieve salvation, you need to understand through your own individual interpretation what the Bible is saying. And if you do have faith, absolute faith in the Bible and what it believes in, what it says, you're guaranteed salvation. And that essentially is going to be part of the subject of the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses are going to be kind of one of Luther's biggest contributions to the Protestant Reformation. It's a series of arguments against the sale of indulgences. He's going to nail them up on Halloween. It's around Halloween when this is published. It's around October 31st, 1517, where we do see this posting of his arguments onto the castle church, on the church castle door in Wittenberg. And again, this is kind of an example of the influence of the printing press. If Martin Luther wasn't able to have access to the printing press, guess what? It would have been a lot harder for people to know what the theses said. Another thing about Luther that is somewhat important is that he's not only going to find support among the nobility, as we'll talk about more later, but he's also going to find support among merchants as well. Luther's whole thing is individual interpretation of the Bible. And if your individual interpretation of the Bible is to justify your actions, well, you could basically use Protestantism to justify what your profession is. And for example, if you do believe this idea that faith alone is how you get salvation, well, how do I kind of demonstrate that I'm following God's will? Well, I need to do something that God gave me the talent for, that God gave me the skill, ability to do. Well, say God gave you the ability, the skill to be a really good merchant. Well, how do you prove you're saved? Well, you make a lot of money in order to prove you're being someone that appreciates the gifts God gave them. So we do kind of see that merchants tend to support the Protestant Reformation. Merchants and the nobility, those are two groups of people who tend to be more Protestant. And we do kind of see Protestant activity more so in countries like the Netherlands, in England, in northern Germany. These are places that have strong merchant presences. Italy, not so much because the Catholic Church is literally right next door. And as we'll talk about later, the Catholic Church is going to stamp out this Protestant stuff wherever it can. All right, so how is the Catholic Church going to respond, speaking of which, to Luther's ideas? Well, they're not going to like him. They're going to put him on trial for heresy or sins against the teachings of the Catholic Church for questioning the Pope's authority. And they are going to excommunicate him. They are going to kick him out of the Catholic Church. They're going to hunt him down and try and execute him as a heretic. Well, guess what? He doesn't die because he's protected by the nobles. Luther is going to find refuge among German nobles because the Catholic Church is supported by German nobles' worst enemy, the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor, remember, is buddy-buddy with the Catholic Church. And we do see that kind of a way to resist the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Emperor is to appeal towards Protestantism. And eventually kind of Luther's teachings and the fact that he was suppressed by the Catholic Church, that's going to lead to a new branch of Christianity, Protestantism. And the more specific one associated with Luther is Lutheranism, kind of a religion, a teaching of Christianity that follows more closely what Martin Luther believes in. Martin Luther, just as a side note, he didn't really like Jewish people. Yeah, not a great guy personally. He also hated poor people. He hated peasants. He thought they were superstitious, and that as much as he hated the Catholic Church, he hated peasants more, and wanted the Catholic Church to stop the peasants from rebelling, as we'll talk about later. Anyway. Well, what is the impact of Luther? Well, Luther is going to open the doors that if one person could question the Catholic Church, maybe other people can. And one such person is a guy by the name of John Calvin. John Calvin is a Swiss Protestant reformer. He lives around the same time as Martin Luther. They hate each other, but they do agree in criticizing the Catholic Church. Calvin is going to develop a kind of branch of Protestantism called Calvinism. And what exactly is Calvinism? Well, Calvinism, I guess a way to put it, is a stricter form of Protestantism, is a stricter way to interpret the Bible. The most important kind of aspect of Calvinism is predestination. It's the idea, and it's an example of kind of the practices of these new branches of Christianity, is this idea of predestination. Essentially, God knows before you're born if you're going to heaven or hell. God is like Santa Claus, according to John Calvin. God knows if you're sleeping, God knows if you're awake, and God knows, much like Santa, if you're going to heaven or hell. It's true. So there's this idea of predestination. However, how do you kind of make sure that you're a part of the saved? How do you prove that you're a part of the people going to heaven? Well, you need to live a life that is in accordance with the Bible. So we do see that Calvinists oftentimes live very kind of simplistic, austere living conditions. So kind of a representation of this is that a Calvinist church is 4 walls, a steeple, and a door, and maybe a spot to read all the Bible stuff, but is very simple, at least compared to a Catholic church. And according to Calvinists, there's this idea that you need to devote your life entirely to God. And kind of a example you might be familiar with are the Puritans. And an example of that you might be more familiar with are the Pilgrims. So US history right there. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in this class later on. Another form of Protestantism that emerges that we'll talk about more later as it relates to political developments is Anglicanism. Basically, what if the Catholic Church didn't have a pope, but the leader of the church, of the Anglican Church, was the King of England. It's a religion that starts because King Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce. We'll talk about that more later. Sorry, Anglicans. Another form of Protestantism that emerges that's very radical is Anabaptists. Anabaptists, they believe in a lot of wacky, crazy things. They believe in that idea of kind of the Bible's the only authority, but it's also the only religious authority as political authority as well. That you shouldn't devote yourself to anything other than religious life. You should separate yourself from secular authority. So basically, Anabaptists kind of say, let's not swear allegiance to anything. It's other than what's in the Bible. And then some groups you might be familiar with, the Mennonites, the Amish, they're examples of Anabaptists. Also, Anabaptists believe that adults should be baptized and not children. That's just a controversial thing, apparently. But the thing about kind of these, this religion in particular, this branch of Protestantism, is that they often are going to face religious persecution. So one of the big results of the Protestant Reformation, in addition to all of these new religions, is going to be the persecution of groups you don't believe in, you don't agree with. So if you are an Anabaptist, well, anywhere, you're probably going to get persecuted. If you're a Catholic in some place like England, you're going to get persecuted. If you're a Protestant in France, well, yeah, you're going to get persecuted, as we'll see later on. So a big impact of the Protestant Reformation, as we're going to see in just a second, is actually going to be this creation of religious diversity, which does lead to religious persecution. You wouldn't need to know those 5 points of Calvinism. This isn't a theology class. This isn't even a class about the Protestant Reformation. But all you would need to know is a more austere, more simple kind of interpretation of fundamental interpretation of the Bible. Well, what else is going to result from the Protestant Reformation? Well, one of the biggest changes in Christianity is going to be the fact that we have new denominations of Christianity. We have both Catholicism and Protestantism. But Protestantism has like a billion different forms of Protestantism. There's Lutherans, there's Calvinists, there's Presbyterians and Reformed churches. There are Anglicans, as I mentioned before. There's Baptists and Methodists and other groups. Technically, Mormons count, but that's a controversial thing. But the impact of the fact that there are new denominations is that religion is no longer a unifying force in Western Europe. Sure, they're all Christian, but they're all different types of Christian. And one of the other impacts of the Reformation is going to be the further weakening of the authority of the Catholic Church. Because if a guy could just say, hey, Pope, I'm not going to listen to you anymore, and I'm still going to go to heaven, well, you can question the church on anything. You could question religion in general on anything. But as we'll see later on in our second part of this chapter, we are going to see that increasingly non-religious leaders, secular leaders, the kings and queens of Europe are going to use the Reformation to their advantage and assume more power for themselves. In Protestant countries and places like England, we see the creation of state churches, of churches whose head of that religion is the head of state. So the head of the Church of England, or Anglicanism, is the King of England. So at this point, in modern day history, it's Charles III. Elizabeth's dead. All right. Elizabeth II, that is, and the first. So anyway, we see kind of in Protestant countries, there's like state religions where the head of state, the king more than likely, is the head of the religion. We see that in Sweden as well. But we're going to see that kind of the Protestant Reformation and the flurry of Protestants is going to lead to Catholic monarchs using the religious diversity of Europe to assume greater power for themselves. It's very easy to target a group of people who are your political enemies if they have a different religion than you. So we will see kind of Catholic monarchs in places like France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. They're going to be very much opposed to minority groups that seemingly challenge their authority. And finally, a result of the Reformation is going to be a broader philosophical idea that you can question the authority of the Catholic Church in religious matters. So there is this increased authority questioning, not only about the Catholic Church's hold on religion, but also the Catholic Church's hold on science and education. And as we'll see later on in the future, a questioning of religion's place in government, a religion's place in society. But another big impact is the rise of literacy. Because all of these Protestant denominations generally agree that you have to read the Bible in order to be saved, well, you need to know how to read. So we will see the rise, especially in Protestant countries, of literacy. We will see kind of the publication of books in the everyday language of the people, so the vernacular. And that's going to actually have the impact of standardizing languages. So everybody, reads the Bible because everybody's a good Christian. It's going to be a book that everybody knows and recognizes. So whatever kind of way you write in that book, whatever grammar or spelling you have in that book, that's going to be kind of the new standard of how that language is spoken. So we actually do see the standardization, the unification, you could say, the uniform grammar and spelling of languages like German, thanks to their translation in the Bible. And this has the effect of increasing national identities. We do see the creation of a German national identity, the start of that at the very least, because of these standardization of the German language. Every German is supposed to read the Bible. So whatever way that words are spelt, whatever grammar is used in the Bible, that's going to be kind of the ideal way to write and speak in German, for example. This also applies to English and French as well. Now, this is a pretty good video from National Geographic. I'll post it somewhere. So you should be able to answer this question right here. What are some causes and results of the Protestant Reformation? So we will continue with part 2 of chapter 1 in the next video. Have a great and blessed day. Hope you enjoyed that. Gosh bless you.